There was once an empire so vast, so powerful, that it was said the sun never set on it. From the icy shores of Canada to the deserts of Africa, from the mountains of India to the islands of the Pacific, the British flag flew high. But how did a small island nation rise to dominate a quarter of the world's land and population? And why, despite all its military might, wealth, and ambition, did the empire eventually unravel? This is not just a story of conquest and control. It is a story of human ambition, rebellion, revolution, war. This is the story of the British Empire. Part 1. The Seeds of Empire. The story of the British Empire begins not with domination, but with desperation. In the late 1400s and early 1500s, England was far from being a global superpower. It was a relatively small, war-weary kingdom on the edge of Europe, watching as Spain and Portugal carved up the riches of the New World. But soon, English ambition set sail. In 1497, John Cabot, under the English crown, reached parts of what is now Canada. Though no immediate empire followed, the voyage planted a powerful seed. As Queen Elizabeth I rose to power in the 16th century, English explorers like Francis Drake and Walter Raleigh pushed outward, raiding Spanish ships, founding colonies, and chasing fortunes. In 1607, Jamestown, Virginia became the first permanent English colony in North America. Struggling at first, it eventually prospered thanks to tobacco, exported using enslaved labor and creating the blueprint for future colonies. The same year, another powerful entity emerged, the British East India Company, founded in 1600. It began as a trading body, but it would become a political monster. The dream of empire had begun. Part 2. Sugar, Slavery, and Expansion, 1600s to 1700s. By the mid-1600s, England, and later Britain, after the union with Scotland in 1707, was building an empire not just in North America but across the Caribbean and Africa. Colonies in Barbados, Jamaica, and Bermuda became massive sugar producers. But this wealth came on the backs of human beings. Britain was a leading participant in the transatlantic slave trade. Over 3 million enslaved Africans were shipped by British vessels to the Americas. The so-called triangular trade, goods to Africa, slaves to the Americas, and raw materials back to Britain, made merchants rich, cities like Liverpool and Bristol boom, and laid the brutal foundation of empire. Meanwhile, Britain was competing fiercely with France and Spain in North America. By the early 1700s, 13 colonies lined the east coast of the US, growing restless under British rule. At the same time, the British East India Company was becoming more than a trading company. It began hiring private armies and forming political alliances in India. In 1757, the Battle of Plassey marked a turning point. Britain, through the company, had become a major Indian power. The first British Empire was rising fast, but cracks were starting to show. Part 3. Losing America, Finding India, 1776 to 1800s. In 1776, a storm broke out across the Atlantic. Fed up with British taxes, exploitation, and military control, the American colonies declared independence. The American Revolutionary War followed, and by 1783, Britain had lost its 13 colonies. It was a massive blow. But the empire didn't collapse. It pivoted. Tension turned toward India and the Pacific. The East India Company, operating with minimal oversight, now ruled over tens of millions. Its private army became one of the largest military forces in Asia. Trade in tea, cotton, and opium grew rapidly, at the expense of Indian farmers and craftspeople. Meanwhile, Australia was founded as a penal colony in 1788. Thousands of British prisoners were transported to settle and develop the new frontier. Though America was lost, a new empire was rising in the East. Part 4. Queen, Industry, and Empire, the Victorian Age, 1837 to 1901. The 19th century marked the peak of the British Empire. Under Queen Victoria, Britain ruled more people than any empire in history. The Industrial Revolution fueled this expansion. British factories needed raw materials, cotton, rubber, coal, and Britain needed markets to sell its manufactured goods. The empire became both workshop and warehouse. Railways, telegraphs, and steamships connected distant colonies to London. The Suez Canal, opened in 1869, became Britain's gateway to India and the East. But it wasn't just trade. It was ideology. The belief in a civilizing mission and the infamous white man's burden led to mass missionary work, English language education, and cultural imperialism. In 1858, after the bloody Indian Rebellion, the East India Company was dissolved, and India came directly under Crown control. The British Raj was born. Africa too became a battleground. During the scramble for Africa, Britain took Egypt, Sudan, Nigeria, and South Africa, often through violent wars and manipulation. The British Empire had never been so vast. But beneath the surface, resistance was building. Part 5. Rebellions, Resistance, and Reforms, 1800s to early 1900s. From Dublin to Delhi, from Accra to Cairo, voices of resistance began to rise. In Ireland, centuries of British control bred deep resentment, sparking revolts and calls for independence. In India, the seeds of nationalism grew, with leaders like Dadabhai Naoroji and Gopal Krishna Gokhale advocating for self-rule. In Jamaica, Paul Bogle led the Morant Bay Rebellion. In South Africa, Britain fought brutal wars with the Zulu, and later the Boers. In response, the British occasionally reformed, but only when pressured. Slavery was abolished in 1833, but economic exploitation continued. In the self-governing dominions, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, settler populations were granted more autonomy. But for non-white colonies, the British grip remained firm. Tensions continued to simmer, and the coming world wars would bring them to a boil. Part 6. World Wars and the Beginning of the End, 1914 to 1945. In 1914, Britain called upon its empire, and it answered. Over 2.5 million soldiers from India, the Caribbean, Africa, and the Dominions fought in World War I. They bled and died on foreign fields, for a country that often treated them as second-class citizens. After the war, promises of reform were broken. Protests erupted, met with brutal crackdowns like the Jallianwala Bagh massacre in 1919, where hundreds of peaceful Indian protesters were gunned down. The interwar years saw a surge in nationalist movements. In India, Gandhi's non-violent resistance began to gain mass support. In Ireland, war broke out, leading to independence for the Irish Free State in 1922. Then came World War II. Once again, the empire rallied. Millions served, fought, and died. But after the war, Britain was exhausted, financially and politically. The empire was no longer sustainable. Part 7. Winds of Change, Decolonization, 1947 to 1980s. In 1947, Britain granted independence to India and Pakistan, leading to one of the largest and bloodiest migrations in history. Burma, Sri Lanka, Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Malaysia, and dozens more gained independence over the next few decades. Some transitions were peaceful. Others, like the Mau Mau uprising in Kenya or the war in Zimbabwe, were violent. The Suez Crisis of 1956 showed the world that Britain could no longer act without American approval. It marked the symbolic end of Britain as a global superpower. Part 8. Echoes of Empire, Legacy, Controversy, and the Commonwealth. Today, over 50 countries belong to the Commonwealth of Nations, a loose association tied to their colonial past. The British monarch remains the head of state in countries like Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. English is a global language. British legal systems, railways, and education models shape many countries. But so too do the scars: partition, racism, stolen wealth, and cultural erasure. Debates over colonial statues, reparations, museum artifacts, and curriculum rage on. Was the empire a force for good, or a machine of exploitation? The answer is not simple. It is painful, multifaceted, and still unfolding. The British Empire rose from trade and ambition, expanded through war and colonization, and collapsed under the weight of resistance and change. It connected the world, but also divided it. It brought technology and systems, but also oppression and bloodshed. To understand the world today, we must understand the empire that once ruled it. Its sun may have set, but its legacy lives on in our laws, languages, borders, and identities. If you found this journey through history insightful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the past. And tell us in the comments, what do you think is the most lasting legacy of the British Empire? We'd love to hear your thoughts.